Earl Whitfield was worth more than he ever let on. 3,000 acres of grazing land and wheat ground in the Smoky Hills of Kansas. A cattle herd that had carried 3 generations. 40 wind turbines turning slow circles on his ridges, paying him a lease check every quarter that was larger than what most men in Harlan County earned in a year. And under all of it, mineral rights he had never sold, because his wife had told him never to sell the ground out from under his own feet. But after Margaret died, Earl began to notice something he could not unnotice. His children called the house, and the calls were never long, and they were never really about him. Dale called when there was paperwork to sign. Sharon called on the way to the airport, talking fast, hanging up faster. Travis called when the trucking company was bleeding and he needed a number with a comma in it. And the calls always ended the same way, with someone saying, "Love you, Dad," in the flat, automatic voice people use for a word they have stopped weighing. So one cold morning in November, Earl Whitfield decided to do a terrible thing. He decided to lose everything. He told his children the ranch had collapsed. He told them a man he trusted had stolen from him, that the bank was foreclosing, that the cattle were being sold and the land was going on the auction block, and that he would walk away from 74 years of his life with a suitcase and almost nothing else. None of it was true. But Earl wanted to know one thing before he died, and there was only one way left to learn it. He wanted to know which of his 4 children loved him, and which of them had only ever loved what he could give them. He did not expect the answer to break his heart at the way it did. To understand why a man would do such a thing, you have to understand what he had built, and who he had built it with. Earl was 22 when his father handed him a failing operation and a stack of unpaid notes, and then died 3 weeks later, as if he had only been holding on long enough to make the transfer official. The year was 1974. The Whitfield place was 400 acres of overgrazed pasture, a herd thinned by a hard winter, and a farmhouse with a sagging porch and a furnace that quit whenever the temperature dropped below 10 degrees. Earl was a tall, narrow kid with big hands and no idea how he was going to make the spring payment. He married Margaret Sorensen that same year. Maggie was a banker's daughter from 2 towns over, which would have been a scandal, the banker's girl marrying the broke rancher, except that Maggie had a way of making her own decisions and daring anyone to argue. She wore her late grandmother's dress to the courthouse. They had $31 between them when they signed the license. Afterward, they ate fried chicken on the tailgate of Earl's truck and watched the sun go down over land. Earl wasn't sure he'd be able to keep. He kept it. They kept it. That was the thing about Earl and Maggie that nobody on the outside ever fully saw. There was no he and she in the building of the Whitfield place. There was only the 2 of them, working like one animal with 2 backs. Maggie did the books at the kitchen table by lamplight after the children were asleep. She knew the price of cattle and the cost of feed and the exact margin between a year they'd remember fondly and a year they'd talk about in hushed voices for a decade. Earl worked the ground and the herd until his hands cracked open in the dry months and bled into his gloves. He fixed fence in weather that sent other men inside. He learned which acres held water and which ones lied to you. They turned 400 acres into 800, then 12. By the time the wind company came knocking in the late 90s, offering to lease the high ridges, Earl had the better part of 3,000 acres and a name people respected at the sale barn. He almost said no to the turbines. He thought they were ugly, and he didn't like the idea of leasing his sky to a corporation. It was Maggie who sat him down and said, "Earl, the land will still be ours. We'll just be selling them the wind, and the wind was never ours to keep anyway." So he signed, and the checks came, quarter after quarter, year after year, more money than 2 children of the Depression had ever known what to do with. They never spent it like rich people. They drove trucks until the trucks died. Maggie clipped coupons until the day she went into the hospital for the last time. The money piled up quietly in accounts and certificates and a portfolio that Earl barely understood and trusted entirely to Maggie, and then, when Maggie got sick, to a lawyer named Lyle Brennan who had been Earl's friend since the second grade. What they spent freely was on the children. There were 4 of them, and they came into the world over the course of 9 years, and each one arrived with a personality already fully formed, as if they'd decided who they were going to be before they ever drew breath. Dale was the first, born in 1975. He was big like his father and restless from the start, a boy who looked at the ranch the way other boys looked at a cage. He worked when he was made to and resented every minute of it, and the day he turned 18, he left for Wichita and a business degree, and never came back for a single harvest. Dale built a good life out there, a commercial real estate firm, a house with a circular driveway, a wife named Renee who collected things, and a pair of kids who'd never sat a horse. Dale measured everything in money because money was the one language he was fluent in. When he looked at his father's 3,000 acres, he did not see his childhood. He saw a balance sheet. Sharon came next, in 1977, sharp-tongued and sharp-minded, the kind of girl who corrected the teacher and was usually right. She went to Kansas City and climbed the inside of a bank until she had a title with the word Vice in it and an office with a view of the river. Sharon was not cruel, exactly. She was busy in a way that had hardened into a kind of armor. She loved her parents the way a person loves an old house they grew up in but would never live in again, fondly, distantly, and with the firm intention of never going back. Her phone was an extension of her hand. Even at her mother's bedside, the screen kept lighting up, and Sharon kept glancing down at it, the way a smoker reaches for a cigarette. They swore they'd quit. Travis was third, born in 1980, and Travis was the one who stayed close. 40 miles down the highway, in the town of Russellton, where he ran a trucking outfit that was always one bad quarter from going under. Travis had his father's hands but not his patience, and he had inherited the family appetite for risk without the family instinct for when to fold. He'd married a woman named Crystal who had champagne ideas on a beer budget, and the two of them lived in a house bigger than they could afford, drove vehicles bigger than they needed, and treated Earl's wealth as a kind of insurance policy that would eventually pay out in their direction. Travis came around more than the others, but he always came around with his hand half open. And then there was Carrie, the last one, born in 1984, when Maggie was 40 and had assumed she was done. Maggie used to call her the surprise that surprised us into being grateful. Carrie grew up trailing her mother through the garden and her father through the calving sheds, and she came out of childhood with her mother's steadiness and her father's stubbornness and none of the family's hunger for more. She became a nurse. She married a quiet electrician named Pete Doyle and settled in a small town a couple of hours east, where she worked long shifts at a regional hospital and raised 2 kids, Emma, who was 8, and Cole, who was 5, in a modest 3-bedroom house with a mortgage and a minivan, and not $1 of margin to spare. Carrie called home every week, not on a schedule, not out of duty, but because she wanted to hear her father's voice. And when Maggie got sick, it was Carrie who came. Maggie's heart began to fail in the spring of her 71st year. It started small, a shortness of breath climbing the porch steps, an ankle that swelled by evening, a tiredness she waved off as old age. By the time they had a name for it, congestive heart failure, the doctors were already speaking in the careful, hedged way doctors speak when they are managing a thing rather than fixing it. There would be good months and bad months, they said. There would be a slow decline, and there was no version of the story where it got better. It lasted 2 years. 2 years of Earl, learning the names of medications, of pill organizers and fluid charts, and a hospital bed that came into the front room and changed the geography of the house forever. 2 years of the woman who had carried the books and clipped the coupons and read the wind growing smaller in front of him, day by day, until some mornings he was afraid to look at how much of her was left. The children responded the way they would later respond to everything. Dale came twice, Both times he stayed under 2 days, and both times Earl caught him on the phone in the driveway in a voice that had nothing to do with his mother, the appraisal, the comps, the per acre. Earl didn't know what it meant then. He filed it away. Sharon came at Christmas once and spent most of the visit in the guest room with the door shut and the laptop open. She sat at her mother's bedside for exactly the length of a meal, then excused herself for a call she said couldn't wait. And the call always could have waited, and they all knew it. Travis came when the route brought him near, which was more often than the others, but never on purpose. He stood in the doorway of the front room rather than sitting in it. He'd ask how Earl was holding up, and then, while Earl was still answering, he'd find a way to mention that the diesel prices were killing him, that the bank had been making noise, that things were tight. And Carrie came every weekend. She drove 2 hours each way, Friday night after a shift, with Emma and Cole asleep in the back seat. She knew how to turn Maggie in the bed so the bed sores didn't form. She knew how to read the fluid in her mother's lungs by the sound of her breathing. She bathed her mother and brushed her mother's hair and painted her mother's nails a pale pink because Maggie had always liked her nails done, and there is a particular kind of love in painting the nails of a woman who can no longer paint her own. On Sunday afternoons, before the long drive home, Carrie would sit on the edge of the hospital bed and read aloud from the worn paperbacks Maggie kept on the shelf, and Maggie, even near the end when the words had begun to slip away from her, would close her eyes and listen. Maggie died on a Tuesday in October. The wheat ground was bare, and the cattle were grazing the stubble, and a cold front was pushing down out of Nebraska. Earl was holding her hand. Carrie was on the other side of the bed, holding the other one. The other three were not there. Dale was in a closing. Sharon was in a meeting. Travis was on the road and said he couldn't have made it in time anyway, which was probably true and which somehow made it worse. In the last clear week she had, Maggie had asked Earl to bring her the cedar chest from the foot of their bed. Inside it, she kept the things a life accumulates: the courthouse dress, the children's baby blankets, a packet of letters Earl had written her during a season he'd spent thawing at a wheat harvest north as a young man. And over those last days, with a pen that shook and a hand Carrie steadied, Maggie wrote 4 letters of her own, one for each child. She sealed them and wrote a name across each envelope and told Earl, "Give these to them when they're ready. You'll know." Earl put the letters in the cedar chest and did not read them. They were not his to read. The funeral filled the Lutheran church on Harlan's main street. 200 people, ranchers in pressed shirts and their wives in dark dresses. The women from Maggie's church circle clustered together in the third pew, men who owed Earl favors, and men Earl owed, and all of them there because Maggie Whitfield had been the kind of woman who made a whole county feel a little more held. Earl sat in the front pew with his 4 children and heard almost none of it. Afterward, in the gravel lot behind the church, Earl saw Dale standing beside a black SUV that didn't belong to anyone he knew, talking to a man in a suit that was too good for a funeral in Harlan County. Earl recognized the man, vaguely, from a billboard on the highway. Land development. Earl heard his oldest son say the words "the back sections," the highway frontage, and then Dale saw his father watching, and the conversation ended, and Dale came over with his face arranged into grief. Inside, in the church basement where the women had laid out ham and scalloped potatoes and a dozen Jell-O salads, Sharon sat at a folding table with her phone face down beside an untouched plate. Every few minutes her hand would drift to it and turn it over, and she'd read the screen, and she'd turn it back down, and she'd lift her face into an expression meant to suggest she'd been present the whole time. Travis found Earl near the coat rack. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, looked at the floor, and asked quietly, like he knew it was the wrong moment and was asking anyway, whether the life insurance had been sorted out yet, and whether Earl had a sense of, the timeline on the estate, just so he could plan. Carrie found Earl in the church kitchen. He was standing at the steel sink with the water running and both hands flat on the counter, not washing anything, just standing, because standing was the only thing he could manage. Carrie walked up beside him and reached past him and turned off the tap. Then she took his hand. She didn't say a word. She didn't try to fix it. She just stood next to her father while the noise of the reception came through the wall, and she held on until he was ready to go back out and be looked at again. That was the funeral. And in the weeks that followed, Earl began to understand that the funeral had told him everything. The calls started about a month after they buried Maggie. Dale called to ask, gently, and then less gently, whether Earl had given any thought to estate planning. The land was a complicated asset, Dale said. It would be a nightmare to divide. Wouldn't it be smarter to liquidate now, while the market was hot, and put everything into something simple? Something the kids could actually use? Dale had a man, he said. A man who could move the land fast and quiet. No auction, no fuss. Earl said he'd think about it. He thought about it for exactly as long as it took to hang up. Sharon called to say, in a tone of brisk efficiency, that Earl really shouldn't be rattling around that big house alone at his age, and had he considered one of those nice independent living communities? There was a lovely one outside Kansas City, she said, not too far from her, which Earl understood to mean close enough that she could check a box, far enough that he couldn't drop by. Travis didn't call so much as appear. He'd swing the truck up the long gravel drive, sit in Earl's kitchen drinking Earl's coffee, and let the conversation drift with the inevitability of water running downhill toward money. The trucking company was restructuring. There was an opportunity, a good one, if he could just get past the cash crunch. A loan, a cosign, a small advance against, what was coming anyway. And Carrie called to ask if he was eating, to ask if he was sleeping, to ask, once, in a voice that caught, whether the house was too quiet, because hers got too quiet sometimes too, and she just wanted him to know he could say so. That first winter without Maggie was the longest of Earl's life, and it was long in a way that had nothing to do with the calendar. It was the silence that got him. 50 years of another person in the house, and a man does not realize how much of a marriage is simply sound. The click of a coffee cup set in a saucer, the hum of a woman talking to herself in the next room, the particular creak of a floorboard under a familiar weight, until all of it stops at once. Earl would come in from the cold at the end of a day and stand in the mudroom and listen, and there would be nothing to hear, and he'd have to remind himself, every time, fresh as a wound, why. He kept her side of the closet exactly as it was. He kept her reading glasses on the windowsill where she'd left them. He ate standing at the counter because sitting at the table across from an empty chair was more than he could do most nights. On the worst evenings, he'd find himself talking to her out loud, telling her about the cattle prices or the broken pump in the south pasture, the way he'd told her every night for half a century, and then catching himself mid-sentence in the empty kitchen and feeling like a fool, and then deciding he didn't care and finishing the sentence anyway. And through all of it, the phone rang, and the phone was never really for him. Dale's calls were about the estate. Sharon's were about facilities. Travis's were about money. There were whole weeks where the only voice that called wanting nothing, wanting only to hear his. Tondramwanaster can die gatter te chur. Jam pradan korayim. Earl started to keep a kind of ledger in his head, the way Maggie had kept the real one at the kitchen table all those years, and the ledger told a story he didn't want to read. Earl sat with all of it, through that first winter. And somewhere in the long, cold, silent months in a house that had held a marriage for half a century, an idea took shape in him that he was ashamed of and could not let go of. He needed to know, not guess, not hope. Know. Which of these 4 people he and Maggie had made would stand by him if he had nothing left to offer them but himself? There was only one way to find out. He took it to Lyle Brennan first because Lyle had been keeping Whitfield secrets since they were boys, and because what Earl was about to do would require a lawyer's help to make it look real. They sat in Lyle's office above the feed store on a gray afternoon in February, and Earl laid it out. He wanted to tell the children the ranch had failed. A trusted manager had stolen from him. Earl had a real foreman named Garrett who'd quit the year before, which made the story plausible. A lawsuit had drained the accounts. The bank was foreclosing. The cattle were being sold. He'd be left with a suitcase and a Social Security check and a pile of debt, and he wanted to watch what each of his children did with that information. Lyle listened with his hands folded over his belly, and when Earl finished, Lyle was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Earl, this could blow up. You could lose them all and find out you were wrong. Then I'll have lost them all and learned something true," Earl said. "I'd rather have a true thing that hurts than a comfortable lie. Maggie used to say that. She said it to me about the wheat prices, and she said it to me about people." Lyle exhaled. "And if one of them passes, what then? Then I'll know who to trust with everything she and I built. And I'll thank God I found out while I was still breathing." So Lyle, against his better judgment and because he loved his friend, helped Earl build the lie. They drew up papers that looked official. They arranged for the cattle to be moved to a neighbor's pasture under a private agreement, so it would look like the herd had been sold off. Earl told his neighbor and old friend Dutch Hollis the truth because he'd need a place to actually go, and because a man needs at least one person who knows what's real when everything else is theater. And Earl sold his good truck. That part was real because he wanted the gesture to cost him something, and bought a faded brown sedan with 190,000 miles on it and a door that didn't lock. Then, on a Sunday in early March, Earl called all 4 of his children and asked them to come home. He had something to tell them, he said. It was important. It was the kind of thing a man should say to his children's faces. They came. Dale drove in from Wichita, irritated at the 4-hour round trip. Sharon came from Kansas City, checking her watch in the driveway before she'd even shut the car door. Travis came from Russellton. Carrie came from the east, 2 hours, with Emma and Cole. Because she always brought the children, because family was a thing you showed your children rather than told them about. They gathered in the front room, in the same space where the hospital bed had stood, and Earl told them the Whitfield place was finished. He'd been robbed, he said. Garrett had been cooking the books for 2 years before he disappeared. The bank had called the operating loan. There was a lawsuit eating what was left. The cattle were already gone. The land was going to auction in the fall. By the time the lawyers and the bank were done, Earl said, he'd be lucky to walk away with the clothes on his back. He'd have to leave the house. He'd have nothing. He sat in his chair with his big cracked hands open on his knees, and he told his 4 children that their father was, at 74 years old, ruined. The room was very quiet, and then Earl said the sentence he had built the whole lie around. He looked at them and he said, "I'm going to need somewhere to live. I was hoping one of you might have room for your old man, just till I get back on my feet." Dale spoke first, because Dale always spoke first. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his face full of concern, and he said all the right words in the wrong order. "Dad, this is devastating. This is just... God, I'm so sorry." And then, almost without a breath between, the pivot. Had Earl talked to a lawyer? A good one. Not Lyle. Lyle was a small-town guy. This needed a real firm. Was there any way to claw back the land before the auction? Because if the land could be moved privately, fast, before it hit the public block, Dale knew a buyer, and there might be enough left over to set Earl up somewhere comfortable. "And as far as me, Dad," Dale said, and here he spread his hands and made his face apologetic, "I'd take you in a heartbeat. You know I would. But we're in the middle of the renovation. The whole upstairs is torn up. Renee's got contractors in and out. It's just not a good time. Maybe, once it's done. In the fall. By the fall, of course, The land would be gone, which Earl understood was exactly the point. Dale wanted the assets stripped and sold before he'd be on the hook for so much as a guest room. Earl looked at his oldest son and saw, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that Dale had already done the math. In the space of 10 minutes, he had grieved the money and not the man. Sharon went next, and Sharon at least was honest in her way, which Earl would later decide he almost respected. She didn't pretend to offer her home. She said plainly that her condo was a one-bedroom in a building with an HOA, that her hours were impossible, that she traveled 3 weeks out of 4, and that it simply wasn't workable. But, and here she brightened, having found the solution that cost her nothing. There were programs. There were facilities. There was assistance for seniors in exactly Earl's situation. She'd send him some links. She knew a social worker who could walk him through the Medicaid spend down, which was the process, she explained, by which a person who once owned 3,000 acres signs away the last of his dignity in exchange for a shared room in a state facility. She said all of this in the helpful managerial voice she used on the phone all day, and at no point did it seem to occur to her that she was talking about her own father. Then her phone lit up on the arm of the couch, and her eyes went to it, and Earl watched the gravity of the screen pull her face down and away from the room, and he knew she was already half gone. Travis surprised him. For about 4 minutes, Travis surprised him. "You'll stay with us," Travis said immediately. "Course you will. We got the room." And Earl felt for those 4 minutes a flicker of something warm, the first warmth he'd felt since he started this terrible experiment. But Travis kept talking, and as he talked, the shape of it emerged. Earl could stay sure, and while he was there, maybe he could help out. Travis had been needing somebody to ride along on the long hauls, somebody he could trust, and it'd be just like old times, the two of them on the road. And Travis lowered his voice and glanced toward the others. "Listen, before the auction, before the bank got its hands on everything, there had to be something movable, right? Equipment, the wind contracts, something. Because if there was, and if Earl signed it over to family now, today, the bank couldn't touch it, and Travis could roll it into the company, and they could keep it in the family instead of letting the bank vultures pick it clean. "I'm trying to help you, Dad," Travis said, and Earl thought he might even have believed it. "But you gotta help me help you. You gotta give me something to work with." There it was. The room in Travis's house came with a price written in small print, and the price was everything Travis assumed Earl had left. When Earl said quietly that there was nothing left to sign over, that the bank had it all, Travis's face changed. The warmth drained out of it. He sat back. "Well?" he said, and the word had a whole accusation folded into it. "Well, then I don't know what you want me to do, Dad. I'm barely keeping my own head above water. I can't take on another mouth for nothing." Crystal would lose her mind. And just like that, the room that had been offered freely was no longer available, because it had never really been offered to Earl. It had been offered to Earl's money. Carrie had not said anything. She'd been sitting on the floor with Cole in her lap and one arm around Emma, listening, and as the conversation went around the room, Earl had watched her face, and her face had gone through grief and then through something harder to name, a kind of quiet, gathering anger at her siblings that she was holding behind her teeth for the children's sake. When the room finally went silent, when Dale had checked his watch and Sharon had returned to her phone, and Travis had crossed his arms in his chair, Carrie stood up. She set Cole on his feet. She walked across the room, and she knelt down in front of her father's chair so she was looking up at him, the way she'd knelt in front of Patience 1,000 times. And she took both of his cracked hands in hers. "Dad," she said, "you're coming home with me. Tonight." Earl started to say something. About the drive, about the kids, about the spare room she didn't have. And Carrie shook her head and stopped him. "Emma will bunk in with Cole. You'll take her room. It's small. The bed's small. The whole house is small, Dad. and you'll hate the wallpaper, and Cole has nightmares and he'll wake you up." Her voice was breaking now, but she kept going, steady underneath the brake, the way a nurse keeps her hands steady even when her voice goes. "And none of that matters. You are not going to a facility. You are not signing anything over to anybody. You are not Dale's problem to solve or Travis's asset to flip. You're my dad. You're coming home with me and we'll figure the rest of it out together, the way Mom would have. Pack a bag." And then she said the thing Earl would remember on his deathbed, the thing he would tell Lyle about that night, with his voice shaking on the phone. She said, "I don't care if you've got nothing. I never loved the ranch. I loved you." The other three were quiet. Dale studied his hands. Sharon's phone had gone dark and she let it. Travis looked out the window, and Carrie, who had the least of all of them, who lived paycheck to paycheck in a small house 2 hours away, packed her father's bag herself, loaded her sleeping children into the minivan, and drove her ruined father home through the dark. She did not know it was a test. She had simply passed it without knowing there was anything to pass, which is the only way the test means anything at all. In the days that followed, the three who had stayed behind showed Earl, without meaning to, exactly who they were a second time. Dale called the very next morning, before 8, and the call was not about whether his father had a roof or a meal. It was about the auction. Dale had been up half the night, he said, running numbers, and he'd had an idea. If the land was going to be lost anyway, why let the bank take it cheap? Dale could front the legal money to fight the foreclosure as an investment, and in exchange Earl would deed him the highway frontage sections now before the sale, so that at least something stayed in the family. By which Dale meant stayed with Dale. Earl listened to his oldest son try to buy the carcass of the ranch before it had finished dying, and he said he'd think about it, and he hung up and sat for a long time with his hand still on the receiver. Sharon did not call at all. 2 days later, an email arrived, efficient, well-formatted, with 3 links to assisted living facilities and the phone number of a social worker, and a closing line that said, "I know this is hard, Dad, but these are your realistic options now. Love you." It was the realistic that stayed with Earl. His daughter had reduced him to a logistics problem and solved it, and the solving had taken her under 10 minutes, and she had felt, Earl was sure, that she'd done something kind. Travis came back out to the ranch on the 3rd day, alone, and the visit started warm and curdled fast. He walked the property with Earl, looking at the empty pasture where the cattle should have been, and the looking had a hungry quality to it, like a man at an estate sale. He asked again about the wind contracts. He asked whether the mineral rights could be signed over before the bank knew to look for them. When Earl said no, that everything was spoken for, Travis's jaw tightened, and on his way out the door he said the thing that Earl would remember as the truest thing his middle son ever said to him. "You know, if you'd been smarter with your money, none of us would be in this spot." As if Earl's ruin were a debt Travis had been forced to pay. And Carrie, 2 hours east, called every single one of those days, to check on him, to tell him the room was ready, to ask again when she could come get him. 3 times in 3 days, wanting nothing, offering everything. Earl gathered the answers like a man gathering stones, and the answers were heavy, and they all pointed one direction. Earl Whitfield lived in his daughter's house for 6 weeks, and they were among the strangest and most clarifying weeks of his long life. He slept in an 8-year-old's bedroom under a ceiling dotted with glow-in-the-dark stars that Pete had stuck up there years before. The bed was too short for him, and his feet hung off the end. The wallpaper was, as promised, terrible. A pattern of faded purple flowers that Carrie kept apologizing for. Cole did have nightmares, and twice in those 6 weeks the little boy padded into Earl's room in the small hours and crawled up beside him, and Earl lay awake, holding his grandson and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a small house full of life, and he understood that this was the richest he had ever been. He saw, up close, what Carrie's life actually was. He saw her come home from a 12-hour shift on her feet and start dinner without sitting down. He saw the careful arithmetic of her grocery list, the coupons. Maggie's coupons, he thought. His daughter clipping coupons just like her mother. The way she'd quietly skip her own lunch so the kids could have the brand they liked. He saw Pete, who was a man of few words, get up at 5 to make Carrie's coffee before her early shifts. Every single morning. No fanfare. Just love expressed as a thermos by the door. He saw a family that had nothing extra and gave it away anyway. And he saw what it cost them to take him in. Not in resentment. There was never 1 ounce of resentment. Not from Carrie. Not from Pete. Not from the kids who thought having Grandpa around full time was the best thing that had ever happened to them. It cost them in groceries and gas and the room they didn't have. Carrie picked up extra shifts and pretended it was a coincidence. Earl was not a fool. He'd run a 3,000-acre operation. He could read a budget by the strain around its edges. He saw his daughter going without, quietly, so that he wouldn't go without, and at no point did she let him see her count the cost. There were small things in those weeks that Earl would carry for the rest of his life. There was the morning Emma came home from school with a drawing of her family, and in the drawing there was a tall stick figure in a hat with a careful line of 8-year-old letters beneath it that spelled, "Grandpa lives here now," and she'd taped it to the refrigerator without ceremony, as if it were simply a fact of the world, settled and good. Earl stood in front of that refrigerator for a long time. There was the evening Cole asked Earl to read him a story. And Earl, who had not read a bedtime story since Carrie herself was small, sat on the edge of the too-short bed and read about a tractor that could talk. And Cole fell asleep against his arm. And Earl did not move for the better part of an hour because moving would have meant the moment was over. And there was the Saturday Pete spent the whole afternoon fixing the brakes on the faded brown sedan Earl had bought to sell the lie and refused to take a dime for the parts. And when Earl pressed him, Pete gave what was probably the longest speech Earl ever heard the man make. "Your family, Earl," he said, not looking up from the wheel well. "We don't charge family. That's not how Carrie was raised, and it's not how we're raising these two." Earl had to go stand in the garage by himself for a minute after that. One evening near the end, Earl was sitting on Carrie's tiny back step watching Emma and Cole chase fireflies in a yard barely big enough for the word yard, and Carrie came out and sat beside him with 2 cups of coffee. They didn't talk for a while. Then Carrie said, not looking at him, "I'm sorry about the others, Dad. I keep waiting to not be angry at them, and it's not happening yet." And Earl, who had set all of this in motion, who knew the cattle were grazing safe on Dutch Hollis's land, and the land was not going anywhere, and the lie was burning a hole in him, looked at his daughter and made a decision. He could not lie to her any more. Whatever else this had been, it could not become a thing he had done to her. He told her that night. He told her about Lyle and the papers and the cattle on Dutch's pasture. He told her there was no embezzlement, no lawsuit, no foreclosure. He told her the ranch was whole, the accounts were full, the wind still turned. He told her he had lied to his own children. "To you," he said, "I lied to you too, and I'm more ashamed of that than all the rest of it together." Because after Maggie died, he had needed to know which of them loved him and which of them loved his money, and he had not been able to think of any other way to find out. Carrie did not say anything for a long moment. Earl braced himself for her to be angry, and she would have had every right. But Carrie, who was her mother's daughter all the way down, finally said, "Did you find out what you needed to know?" "I did," Earl said. "Then it wasn't for nothing." She wiped her face with the back of her hand and let out a long, shaky breath. "I'm furious at you, Dad. You scared the hell out of me. I was lying awake doing math, trying to figure out how to take care of you on what we make." She paused. "And I'd do it again tomorrow. The math, all of it. You hearing me? Nothing about that money would have changed what I did. I just wish you'd known that without having to lose everything to find it out." "I do know it now," Earl said. "That's the difference. Now I know it the way I know the sun comes up. Not because you told me, because you showed me when you thought I had nothing." He gathered all four of them at the ranch the following Sunday. When Dale and Sharon and Travis walked into the house and saw it unchanged, the furniture, the photographs, the whole life still standing, and then walked to the window and saw cattle grazing the near pasture, you could watch the understanding move across their faces like weather. Lyle was there. Carrie was there, standing by the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, having agreed to keep the secret of her own knowing for one more hour. Earl told them the truth. All of it. He stood in the front room where his wife had died, and he told his three older children that the collapse had been a lie, a test, and that he was sorry for the deception and not at all sorry for what it had taught him. He told them what each of them had done. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Dale," he said, "you tried to sell the ground out from under me before the body was cold. You looked at your father losing everything, and the first thing you thought of was how to move the land fast and quiet. Sharon, you offered me a brochure and a Medicaid form. Travis, you offered me a bed and then put a price on it, and when the price couldn't be paid, the bed disappeared. He let that sit. And Carrie loaded her babies in the van at 9 o'clock at night and drove me home to a house with no room for me, and never once asked what was in it for her, because there was nothing in it for her, and she came anyway. The room was silent in a way that had weight to it. Dale's face had gone red and then white. Sharon was staring at the floor. Travis opened his mouth, and Earl held up one hand, and Travis closed it. "I'm not telling you this to punish you," Earl said, and his voice softened, because he was, after everything, a father, and the three of them had been his babies once, too, and Maggie had loved every one of them with a love that did not check anyone's behavior first. "I'm telling you because it's true, and because your mother used to say a true thing that hurts is worth more than a comfortable lie. You needed to hear a true thing. I needed to say it." The will Earl rewrote in the weeks that followed was not a weapon. Lyle had braced for vengeance, and there wasn't any. The land, the whole 3,000 acres, the herd, the wind contracts, the mineral rights, everything that was the Whitfield place and could not be cut into pieces without ceasing to be itself, went into a trust with Carrie as steward. Not because Carrie had won a contest, but because Carrie was the only one of the four who had ever wanted the land to stay land, the only one who would keep it whole, work it or lease it honestly, and hand it down to Emma and Cole as a thing that was theirs to belong to, rather than a thing to be sold. Earl had finally understood the difference between an heir and an owner, and only one of his children was an heir to what the place actually was. The money, the accounts, the certificates, the portfolio Maggie had built coupon by coupon, Earl divided into 4 equal shares. Equal. Dale's share was exactly the same as Carrie's. He surprised even Lyle with that. When Lyle asked him why, after everything, he'd give the 3 of them an equal cut of the cash, Earl said, because Maggie wouldn't have done it any other way. She'd have said the money was never the point, so why use it to keep score? The land was the point, and the land's going where it belongs. There were no punitive clauses, no conditions designed to make his children dance for their inheritance. Earl had put them through one test, and he had decided that was enough. He would not make the rest of their lives into a test, too. What he added, in his own shaking hand, on a separate page Lyle stapled to the back of the trust, was not a legal provision at all. It was a request. Sunday supper at the home place, first Sunday of every month. There's room at the table for everyone who wants to come. Come because you want to. Nobody's taking attendance. And then there were the letters. Earl brought the cedar chest down from the bedroom on the day he told them the truth, and after the hard things had been said, he opened it and took out the 4 envelopes Maggie had written with her shaking hand in the last clear week she had, and he gave each child the one with their name on it. He never asked what was in them. They were not his to read, and they were not his to know. But he watched his children's faces as they read their mother's last words to them, and he saw something move in each of them that no test and no will and no lecture from him had been able to reach. He saw Dale, his big, restless oldest son who measured everything in money, read his mother's letter and put his hand over his mouth and turn his face to the wall. He saw Sharon's phone slip off her knee and hit the floor and stay there, forgotten, for the first time in years while she read. He saw Travis fold his letter very carefully along its creases when he was done and hold it against his chest like something that might blow away. Earl never learned exactly what Maggie wrote, but he knew his wife, and he knew that whatever those letters said, they had been written by a woman who saw each of her children clearly, flaws and all, and loved them anyway, and forgave them in advance for the people she knew they were still going to be. That was Maggie's gift, the one Earl had spent 47 years standing next to. She did not love people for passing tests. She just loved them. He understood, holding the empty cedar chest, that this was the difference between his wife and himself, and that he had spent the last hard year trying, clumsily, with a lie, to learn the thing she'd known by instinct. The first Sunday supper was the following month, and they all came. Carrie organized it because Carrie organized everything now, the way Maggie used to. She drove out Saturday and filled the old farmhouse with the smells it had lost, pot roast and mashed potatoes and green beans and Maggie's pie recipe, which Carrie made from the card in her mother's tin box, and which came out, she said, almost right, not quite, never quite. That's how I know it's Mom's. Dale came, and he came alone the first time, and he stood in the kitchen doorway with his hands in his pockets. A successful man who suddenly didn't know how to be in his father's house without an agenda. Carrie handed him a knife and a cutting board and a pile of carrots. And Dale, who had not done a chore in that kitchen since he was 18, sat down at the counter and cut carrots in silence, and Earl watched from the next room and felt something in his chest he hadn't felt in years come loose. Sharon came, and her phone stayed in her bag, and she sat on the floor and let Emma do her hair into something ridiculous and laughed at the result, a real laugh, the kind that surprises the person it comes out of. Travis came with Crystal, and he didn't ask anyone for anything, and after supper he and Pete stood out by the calving shed talking about engines for an hour, two men who had nothing in common reaching for the one thing they did. And Earl sat at the head of the table, in Maggie's chair. He'd moved it to the head that morning, retiring his own because she had always been the center of the family and it was time the seat acknowledged it, and he looked down the length of the mismatched, overcrowded, imperfect table at the people he and Maggie had made. The cattle were on the ridges. The wind was turning. The land was whole and going where it belonged, and his children, all four of them, were under one roof eating their mother's pie. He had set out to learn which of his children loved him and which of them loved his money. He had gotten his answer, and it had cost him more than he expected and broken something he wasn't sure would fully mend. Only one of them had passed. He would not pretend otherwise. He was too old and too honest for that. But sitting at the head of the table in his wife's chair, Earl understood something Maggie could have told him for free, if he'd only had the wisdom to ask while she was alive. The test had never really been about the children at all. They had each shown him exactly who they were. The question that mattered, the only question that had ever mattered, was what he was going to do with what he'd learned, whether he'd use it to wall himself off or to build a longer table. He reached for the chain around his neck, where he'd worn Maggie's wedding ring since the day they buried her, and he held the small, warm circle of gold between his thumb and finger. "You'd have been furious with me," he said to her silently, in the noise of his full house. "The lying, all of it. But you'd have come to the table," he thought. "You always did." From the kitchen, Carrie called out that the second pie was ready, and Cole climbed into Earl's lap without asking, the way only a child who has never once doubted his welcome will do, and Earl Whitfield, 3,000 acres, 40 turbines, mineral rights, and a fortune Maggie built one clipped coupon at a time. None of which was the point. None of which had ever been the point. Wrapped both arms around his grandson and stayed exactly where he was. The Sunday suppers did not fix everything. Earl was too honest to pretend they did. Some months one of the three didn't come, and the empty chair said what it said. But more months than not, they came. Dale started driving out alone on the odd Saturday, just to walk the back sections with his father, not to appraise them anymore, just to walk. Sharon learned to leave her phone in the car. Travis, who had spent his life with his hand half open, surprised everyone the spring the trucking company finally folded by not asking Earl for a dime, and by accepting instead when Earl offered him work helping run the cattle on the home place. It turned out Travis was good with the herd. He had his father's hands after all. He just never let himself use them for anything that didn't pay quick. And Carrie, who had passed a test she never knew she was taking, kept doing exactly what she had always done, which was to call her father every week wanting nothing, and to set a place at her table for whoever needed one. She never grew rich. She never wanted to. She told her father the truest thing anyone had said to him in years, on the night she packed his bag and drove him home through the dark, and she had meant every word of it, and she would have meant it just the same if he'd had nothing at all. "I don't care if you've got nothing," she had said. "I never loved the ranch. I loved you." Earl carried that sentence in his chest the way he carried Maggie's ring on its chain, close to the skin, warm from his own body, the one thing he was certain of in a long life of uncertain things. He had spent 74 years building something he thought was his fortune. It took losing all of it, on purpose, in a lie, to find out where the real one had been sitting the whole time. At his own table, in his daughter's small house with the terrible wallpaper, in the only one of his 4 children who had reached for him in the dark and never once reached for his pockets. Only one of them had passed. But one, it turned out, was enough to build a whole table around.